Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm hoping everybody's doing well. We're going to continue with our siege on Detroit, Fort Detroit there. So last time we talked about how Pontiac had attacked or attempted to attack Fort Detroit, and he ended up realizing that it was not a good thing to do because the British were already prepared. They knew he was coming, they knew his plan. They had secured the fort even more. So now we're going to move on to, he left the fort. Now he called all the war chiefs together and decided to have a siege on Fort Detroit, hoping to get them to leave or to surrender. And he was hoping for the French army to come and help him out and assist because they wanted the French to come back. And he tried using some mind games in the process by sending messages of different native tortures that they would do when they got him. But Gladwin, as you recall, is the post commander of Fort Detroit. He didn't react. He didn't buy what was being said. He just, okay, whatever. And, he knew that they were going to survive it. So one thing about Fort Detroit, that the river was on one side of it, so the siege could only happen on three sides. And here you can see, this is a picture I found of the fort. Here's another old map of it that's kind of difficult to see, the fort. But you can see the fort here. And so they were only able to have the siege on three sides, which meant that the fort could still get supplies from the river. And if they had to abandon it, they could, because they could go out through the river there. And Gladwin knew that Pontiac was not going to actually attack the fort. He just knew he had to wait him out. And eventually, two of the tribes, the Huron and the Potawatomi, decided that they were done. And so they went to Gladwin and said, okay, for a full pardon and some supplies to last through the winter, we will remain and be spies within the camp and let you know what Pontiac is doing. So they did that, kind of turned on their other natives. And so, anyways, the French were not going to come as it happened because they had lost the 7 Years' War. So Pontiac did not realize that had happened at the time. And so, if you recall, the governor general of the area, Amherst, he kind of came back in the picture here and decided he wanted to eliminate the natives, and he had several plans of doing it. And he had, some of them were horrific, some were just not great. But fortunately, that didn't come to play because finally Pontiac heard that the French had given up over in Europe and that they weren't coming. So he called for a meeting with Gladwin. Him and Gladwin sat down, talked, and Pontiac doesn't actually surrender. He just decides to pull back and he leaves the forts. And he also called for all the other forts to abandon that they had taken on and fought and won. So some of those other forts that they had won was on May 16th, Fort Sandusky Falls, May 25th, Fort St. Joseph in Niles, Michigan, May 27th, Fort Miamis, June 1st, Fort, now this one throws me off here, Avatenen in Lafayette, Indiana, and of course on June 2nd, Fort Michilimackinac. I'm going to go into Fort Michilimackinac here a little bit. That was one of their greatest attacks. The natives decided they were going to play lacrosse up there in honor of the king's birthday. So they got the fort commander to agree to this. And so the British thought, okay, sounds good. And so the natives that were actually watching the lacrosse game, it was kind of weird. They were all bundled up in blankets. Well, underneath the blankets, they had all their guns and knives and weapons. So eventually a call was made out. They threw them off, handed out all the weapons, and attacked. And from what I've heard, virtually, and what I've read, virtually all men, women, and children were killed in this attack. So that was a brutal attack. And Pontiac, he didn't actually realize the harm he was doing to his own people by keeping them having this siege, because then they weren't hunting and fishing to help prepare for their winter coming up. Because during this whole time, they would have been preparing and starting to get things going, and they weren't. So he eventually leaves Michigan. He goes to Illinois, and in 1769, he's murdered by another native that disliked Pontiac for his hatred of the British. So Pontiac is gone. So that's kind of where that name Pontiac comes from, our city here in Michigan. So one thing too, there is this author, Janie Lynn Panagopoulos, and this is Mark of the Bear Claw. This is a story, and she spends 7 years researching every book that she writes. And so, she researched this book. This story starts in Detroit during the siege and during the whole thing, because it starts out with, the young boy, he's not sure what's happening, but he knows something is happening. So him and his grandfather, his mom's like, get out of here, leave. And they send him on his vision quest up to Mackinac, which he ends up in Mackinac during that June 2nd battle on Fort Michilimackinac. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And just a little side note, he's canoeing going up there, going all the way up. If you think about it, going all the way up through Lake Huron there. And one thing this author has done is, I've had lunch with her several times. She has actually canoed in those Straits of Mackinac. So she knows what it's like and what a young boy and his grandfather would have gone through when they were canoeing. So she also keeps in the back of her books lots of facts and also a nice glossary of terms that are used within her stories. So you ever get a chance, great author. She writes a lot of Michigan stories to read. So hope that helps you finish up this little attack and siege on Fort Detroit and what happened with Fort Michilimackinac and where the name Pontiac, or once one of our cities here in Michigan, came from. I hope everyone is doing well. Have a good weekend.